Welcome to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, RELS 100, Week 14b. I was a little optimistic last time and thought I could get through all of these slides in one online lecture, but in fact, it seemed better to break it into two. I want to return to the power of modern science and its relationship with religion in this period, and how modern science grew up in many ways from the kind of monotheistic tradition which has a creator who creates a creation, a cosmos, creates a creation, who creates a cosmos and not a chaos. Berkeley Nobel laureate Charles Towns, Go Bears, that's my alma mater, said, for successful science of the type we know, we must have faith that the universe is governed by reliable laws, and further that these laws can be discovered by human inquiry. So a major force in Western civilization is the science and even more the philosophy that emerged from Charles Darwin. He's one of the key figures in modern atheism, though he was an agnostic and not an atheist. An agnostic meaning he didn't know whether there was a God. He determined you couldn't figure it one way or another, but he did leave Christianity around aged 40. Nonetheless, many atheists look to Darwin, whose dates are 1809 to 1882. Darwin, the son of a pastor, studied theology at the University of Cambridge, and as I was saying, he left the Christian faith around age 40, became an agnostic based on the idea of the problem of evil. That is, if there's a good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God, how can that God allow for evil in the world? Either God must be not good, or not all-knowing, or not all-powerful. And Darwin's young daughter died around age 9 or 10, and Darwin could not square that with the God that he had learned in the Christian faith. And so he replaced in the theory of natural selection that he presented. Theory meaning a guiding scientific approach, not a hypothesis, not a guess, but a theory in that sense of natural selection. I have called this principle by which each slight variation, if useful, is preserved by the term natural selection. He presented this in 1859, and if you're doing your dates, he had already left the Christian faith by then, 10 years earlier, but it was through going to the Galapagos Islands and studying how each island, because it was distinct from the other islands, had unique kinds of variations among various animals. He found that it was natural selection, similar to artificial selection, which, say, animal farmers do in practice. Natural selection, the selection that nature presents, will lead to these variations. The reception of Darwin's theory, and this is important for our purposes, by religious leaders was mixed, not all negative. Listen, in fact, to the final sentences of Darwin's Origin of Species, again, 1859, this very powerful and somewhat controversial book. There is grandeur in this view of life, with its several powers having originally breathed by the Creator. From so simple a beginning, endless forms most beautiful and most wonderful have been and are being evolved. So 19th century, Asa Gray, the evangelical Christian and botanist at Harvard, promoted the ideas of Darwin. In fact, it's said that Gray was one of the greatest promoters of natural selection and evolution in the United States. Again, an evangelical Christian, evangelical Protestant. Charles Kingsley in England, similarly as a religious leader, brought an approach. Now, I will mention others who are concerned about the naturalistic assumptions and the lack of a guiding direction for natural history, which is called the lack of teleology, and for some contradictions with biblical teachings, the literalists who believed that the 6 days of Genesis chapter 1, the first chapter of the Bible, were 6 24-hour days and couldn't possibly be the length of time needed for natural selection. It wasn't just those issues, though. There were also scientific problems with evolution. There was no mechanism for inheritance. How did these changes get passed down? Darwin had some thoughts, but nothing really definitive, and it was Gregor Mendel himself, actually, again, very much in the Christian tradition, the Catholic Christian tradition, who pioneered genetics after Darwin's death in the late 19th century. And then the idea also that from Lord Kelvin and many others that the Earth is not old enough. Lord Kelvin, after whom the Kelvin scale of heat is named, believed that the Earth could only be 100 million years old at most. Not enough time for evolution to occur. I mentioned Asa Gray. I mentioned also this lack of teleology. This was presented by Charles Hodge. And he said, Hodge did, the theologian at Princeton Seminary, who knew a great deal about science, he said, if Darwin's theories deny a direction, that there's a direction toward life and toward the emergence of human beings, then it is tantamount to atheism. Two prominent books in the late 19th century promoted Darwinism as being part of a conflict or warfare thesis. The writers and historians Andrew Dixon White and John William Draper promoted the conflict thesis, that there's always been a conflict between science and religion. One of them, Andrew Dixon White, was forming the first university that was secular. It wasn't based on training of ministers like Harvard and Princeton had been, but instead that Cornell College would be a completely secular university. And Dixon White, who himself was within a liberal Christian tradition, saw, though, a conflict or warfare that had gone on, and he wanted to extricate religion from the university so that science could have free reign. In 1925, the Scopes monkey trial became an infamous experience of science versus religion, especially conservative Protestants against evolution, when a substitute high school teacher, John Scopes, was accused of violating Tennessee's Butler Act, which forbid and made unlawful to teach human evolution in any state-funded school. This brought Clarence Darrow on the side of free thinking, and William Jennings Bryan, the famous politician and orator, on the side of traditional religion, to blows, as it were, not literally, but in the courtroom. Two great prominent thinkers, great in the sense of their platform, their followers, we would say today. Ultimately, the trial was acquitted on a technicality, but for many, especially as this trial was presented in a later play called Inherit the Wind, and in the movie of the same name, the warfare between science and religion, particularly between fundamentalist Christianity and evolution, was cemented. Neo-Darwinism is what occurred as Darwinist thinking and evolution continued to develop in the 20th century. It's especially the discovery of DNA by Francis Crick and James Watson in 1954 and the double helix. As the Brown University biologist Ken Miller summarizes the three elements: there's mutation, there's variation, and there is natural selection. So there are today four primary religious responses to Darwinism. There's young earth creationism, that the world was created directly by God 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. You'd think of Ken Ham and Answers in Genesis and his museum that support this young earth creationist idea, based not really primarily on scientific work, but on a reading of the Bible, which then, honestly, the science is fitted to connect with. There's old earth creationism related to organizations like Reason to Believe in Southern California and Hugh Ross. The world was created a long time ago, that the day in Hebrew, in the Genesis 1, that God created in the first day and the second day, etc., that day can mean an indefinite period of time, that the earth is old, but that there is not evolution in terms of biological evolution. The intelligent design movement, promoted particularly in the 1980s and 90s, sees problems with Darwinism, which can only be explained by intentional creation. In 2005, the teaching of intelligent design as a legitimate scientific theory was rejected at the Dover trial, which was a final defeat, really, for the prominence of intelligent design as a scientific possibility to teach in schools overall, although it has a lot of traction in Protestant churches. And then finally, evolutionary creation. People like Francis Collins, the head of the National Institutes of Health, who talks about this as an evangelical Christian, accepting all the elements of evolutionary theory, but brings it together with theistic religious belief. So in the United States, that's primarily connected with Christianity, but it also exists in Judaism and Islam. Moving then to other key figures besides Darwin. Again, Darwin not himself an atheist, but used by atheists to promote their theories. Sigmund Freud, born in a practicing Jewish family, lived from 1856 to 1939. He declared that religion is an illusion. Illusion is a technical term meaning a wish fulfillment. And so he developed psychoanalysis to understand truth about religion and to uncover our unconscious drives. Karl Marx in 1818 to 1883 are his dates. Also from a Jewish background, living in Christian Germany, found not the problems of the psyche, but the problems of society. Quote, religion is the opiate of the masses, end of quote. Primarily meaning religion has given people a hope for something beyond this world and not called us to bring about social change, and especially the communist revolution that he promoted. History and its class struggle become central with Freud. And then probably the greatest philosopher of this, Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844 to 1900, a son of a pastor, Lutheran pastor in Germany, who announced that God is dead. God is dead, and that Christianity is immoral. It's a slave religion which lifts up the humble and the meek instead of the powerful and those who are excelling. And instead, Nietzsche promoted the idea of the Übermensch, or the Superman, the man who realizes the human predicament, who fashions his own values and who creates his own values and fashions his life accordingly. Nietzsche, Marx, and Freud, and Darwin, these atheists that I learned when I was in college a few decades ago as the key thinkers of what would be 20th century atheistic thought. Back to Darwin. I believe, but I cannot prove, writes Richard Dawkins, the Oxford evolutionary biologist, that all life, all intelligence, all creativity, and all design, so-called design, anywhere in the universe is the direct or indirect product of Darwinian natural selection. It follows that design comes late in the universe after a period of Darwinian evolution. Design cannot precede evolution and therefore cannot underlie the universe. And though atheists are about 3% of the U.S. population and agnostics 4%, they have influential voices in our country and look to thought leaders like Dawkins. I read a statistic once that approximately 1 in 4 university professors or lecturers are atheists or agnostics. So it's an overrepresented position often in universities. To technology then, as an outgrowth of science, a thought for you. Peter Thiel has written, and he's the founder of Palantir Investing, a major Silicon Valley figure in technology. Humans are distinguished from other species by our ability to work miracles. We call these miracles technology. Thiel, who himself, at least in what I've read from him, sees himself as a Christian, yet sees that what used to be called miracles is now called technology. I want to offer a few notes on where we are today with these religious traditions as we close our time in this final lecture. Islam today, it's a religion of, as I've said before, about a quarter of the world's population, with two main branches, meaning Sunni and Shia, about 1.8 billion people. It is the fastest growing religion in the world. Some predict that it will overtake Christianity in size by 2050 based on birth rates and conversions and the spread of its faith. It's always good to recognize that Islam has been part of the U.S. history since the 17th century slave ships. There was a reinvigoration of Islamic nations and going just to 1979 with the Iranian Revolution, the Shiite Revolution. The history of Islam is the Shiites have been based in the Iranian area. as a response to Western colonialism. And so there's an emergence of Islam. As Prothero says, it is at the top of the heap in terms of impact today. 9/11/2001 put Islam into the minds of many Americans, and part of this class is to take on what that means and how to combat Islamophobia, but also how Islam relates to globalism and Western values. In Judaism, today, about 22% of Jews in the U.S. are Orthodox, about 33% are conservative, about 38% are Reformed. Reform being the most liberal of those branches, very important in our country, accepting rabbis, accepting gay marriage as part, for example, of their movement to see the Torah interpreted in not as a text that is to be seen as the same for all time and all places, but interpreted in the light of contemporary questions and moves. And of course, many Jews do not subscribe to any movement and may, in fact, be atheist in orientation. 50% of Jews doubt God's existence. Also, one of the keys in American history and American Judaism is the intermarriage of Jews with Christians, in which when I lived in New York, where there's many of the Jewish people who live in our country live in New York City, I heard from some rabbis that this is a silent Holocaust, that gradually this is a way, a very striking phrase, of course, a way that Judaism is being lost in our country in the eyes of some. Of course, the Holocaust itself, from 42 to 45, the killing of 6 million Jews at the hands of the German National Socialists, is the Nazis, is a key experience for Jews. And the establishment of Israel out of that in 1948, which we still struggle with today, and the relationship, particularly of the Jews, with evangelical Christians who see the fulfillment of the establishment of Israel as a fulfillment of prophecy, and the country itself sees it that way. I remember going to the Holocaust Museum. Right up as you come in and as you leave is from Ezekiel, the book of Ezekiel, that the reestablishment of Israel as prophesied in the book of Ezekiel. The 1967 Six Days War and the victory for Israel, which is seen as an establishment of the legitimacy and of Israel against its enemies. And today, of course, we continue to see the struggle with Palestinians, how to care for the people, particularly in Gaza, and also how to find the place of Israel within terrorists who are, often fueled by a form of Islamic ideology. Christianity, remember again that it is broken into these three branches of Catholic, Protestant, and Orthodox. About 1.2 billion Roman Catholics, 260 million Orthodox, Eastern Orthodox, and almost 1 billion Protestants, which include fundamentalists, evangelicals, non-denominational churches, Pentecostals, charismatics, and so on. Christianity has been, especially Protestantism, the dominant religious force in the U.S., but that, of course, is changing. In fact, there's an increase of secularism in Europe and the United States. Just recently, it was put out by the Gallup poll that only 47% of people in the U.S. belong to any religious group, primarily churches, which is lower than it's been in the 70 years that Gallup has been doing that poll. And it is low enough that now it's a minority of Americans for the first time in our history. So we see disaffiliation, the challenges of science and technology and secularism, the decrease of various denominations. And yet, throughout the world, the rise of Pentecostalism, the experience described according to Pentecostals, the experience of Pentecost described in Acts in the New Testament, where the Holy Spirit comes on people and gives prophecy and healing, traced back to the famous 1906 Azusa Street revival in LA, and now one of the most powerful expressions of Christianity throughout the world, Catholicism having undergone the changes of Vatican II, John the 23rd saying, let's open the windows to the world outside, and yet then a retrenchment in the 1968 encyclical, which forbade birth control, Humanae Vitae. And then now again, and with Pope Francis, the changes that have come from 2013 on, moving away from the focus on doctrine to something much more about social change. It's worth closing with Christianity, in this reflections, these brief little notes on Christianity, by saying Africa is the fastest growing region for Christianity. It gains about 23,000 Christians a day. That is, almost over 8 million a year. Whereas the Western world, U.S. and Europe, lose about 6,000 Christians a day, or 2 million a year. The church is growing in Africa especially, but also in Asia and South America. As just one example, in Nigeria, the 70 million Anglicans outnumber the Anglicans in Europe and the U.S. In Kenya, 80% are Christian, and 34% particularly profess Christ as Savior, which is the language used by evangelicals in Europe, for example, and the same percentage as the amount of evangelicals in Europe. So these shifts, in 1900, 80% of Christians were in the West. Today, 75% of Protestant Christians are in the non-Western world. So I leave you with the thought of, what then is the future of Western religion? What is the future of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam in light of all these various forces? What do you think?